Dr. Annet Kirabo, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brady, for the invitation to participate in this podcast and share, about our recent advances in contribution of the gut microbiota to cardiovascular disease. It seems like most of the discussion has already been going on in Twitter, but and I'm not sure if I'm going to add anything, but let's see.
No, I'm sure you will add plenty to the Twitter discussion that has been going on. So before we get started, can you just tell listeners a little bit about yourself, where you are currently doing research, and maybe a little bit of your educational background in some of your training?
Yeah, so my name is Annet Kirabo. I'm an associate professor at Vanderbilt. I recently became an associate professor at Vanderbilt, and so I work mainly, we work on the role of inflammation in cardiovascular disease. And recently, as you know, we have looked at the contribution of the gut microbiota. We are also looking at, HIV with collaboration with researchers in sub-Saharan Africa, and how excess dietary salt contributes to the gut microbiota or causes this bacterial dysbiosis, leading to high blood pressure.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. And I know recently, the microbiome is kind of very popular, not only in the scientific kind of research field, but it's also a very kind of popular topic in like the media. You hear about, gut dysbiosis, or a healthy gut or an unhealthy gut. So it's I think a topic that people are interested in, but to be honest, a lot of people probably don't understand. So I'm very excited to sort of talk about some recent advances in this area. So how did you I would like to hear maybe a little bit about just kind of how you got into this research area. Was the microbiome something you were always interested in, or kind of what led you to focus on this topic of research that you're currently doing?
So the work in the microbiota for us, how we initiated this was kind of a serendipitous encounter. I attended a talk at Vanderbilt by Dr. Jim Ferguson. And in that talk, she was talking about the impact of the diet, or different components of diet, on how they impact the gut microbiota, leading to different diseases. And she's an epidemiologist, and she was looking at just the impact of microbiota dysbiosis in different diseases. And so I approached her after a talk, and I asked her, can we look at the impact of sodium, because I'm interested in sodium. And if there are people, she had studied the cohort of people of about 135 people. And so I asked her if we can divide these people, between those who are following the American Heart Association guidelines and those who are not following the American Heart Association guidelines, which is about 2.3 grams of sodium a day, which is equivalent to 1 teaspoon of sodium. So she accepted that we analyzed those data by, the people eating low salt or high salt based on American Heart Association guidelines. And, we were so pleasantly surprised that there was a huge difference in gut microbiota between these people. There was profound dysbiosis in the people who do not follow, who refuse to follow the guidelines of the American Heart Association, with increased Firmicutes bacteria and bacteria of genus Prevotella. And we did mechanistic studies in mice, whereby we fed mice a high salt diet, and we found similar results in mice. When we fed them a high salt diet, and this was associated with increased activation of immune cells, dendritic cells, and these accumulate products of reactive oxygen species known as isolevoglandins that we have studied a lot. And these dendritic cells then activate T cells, and these T cells can then attack the vasculature. There was a question on Twitter about how the vascular dysfunction happens in in hypertension. So these T cells can go and release cytokines that induce vascular dysfunction. So that's how, we got into this field of gut dysbiosis and hypertension.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And you kind of answered my question, because I was going to ask, you talk about how the people who weren't following the dietary guidelines, they had, gut dysbiosis. And then you thought, oh, they're also eating probably like a high salt diet. But obviously you need to sort of dissociate those two, because people who don't follow the guidelines, they may be eating a lot of salt, but they're probably also eating a lot of other unhealthy foods. So I think most people would ask, well, is it actually the salt, or is it something else that they're eating? Maybe a lot of red meat, or a lot of processed sugar, or refined carbohydrates. But as you just mentioned, you have been doing some mechanistic studies, and we can probably talk about those a little bit later, showing that if you feed a high salt diet, this actually can cause dysbiosis and endothelial dysfunction. So kind of fascinating stuff showing that. I kind of want to maybe rewind just a little bit, because we're going to be talking about effects of the microbiome on cardiovascular disease, but I think it would be helpful if people had a general idea of what maybe the gut microbiome actually was, just kind of from a 30,000, foot perspective. So can you just tell us a little bit, like, what is the gut microbiome in general, and maybe what are some of like the key things that people should understand? Because it's very fascinating. I was reading your recent paper that you published, and there are just so many like bacteria in our microbiome. It was like 100-fold more genes in our gut than in the human genome. So can you just do a brief overview of the gut microbiome for listeners before we get into the cardiovascular disease mechanisms and things like that?
Yes. So basically, there's a difference between microbiome and microbiota, and people use these interchangeably, but the right, we need to define these. The gut microbiota are the bacteria that are found, like humans, we are surrounded by bacteria, both externally and internally, and not just in the gut, but in the mouth, in the, reproductive cavity. So the bacteria that are found within the digestive system, are the ones that we are referring to as the gut microbiota, and those are diverse. And we find, we have some findings that some of them, different changes are related to cardiovascular disease, but it is, no one really knows exactly what bacterial species. There's some reports, but exactly what bacterial species on the genus level, even on the species level, that is contributing and how it is contributing to cardiovascular disease.
Got it. So you're saying that the microbiota and the microbiome are sort of two different things?
Microbiome is, it refers to mainly the genetic component of the.
I see.
It is, of the bacteria, but if you're referring to the bacteria themselves, the correct term is microbiota.
Okay, I think that's a good, important distinction to make. And so what is dysbiosis then? I guess when we hear this kind of in the popular kind of media, people sometimes will call it like a, unhealthy gut or something, but the correct term is kind of dysbiosis if we're talking about an unhealthy gut microbiome. So what is gut dysbiosis? When we say that term, what are we kind of referring to?
Dysbiosis, in simpler terms, it can mean a dysfunctional biota, and we're still, we're still defining this, because no one knows what a healthy, people have made some conclusions what a healthy gut microbiota looks like and how different it is from a dysfunctional microbiota. But in the context of disease, people have done associative studies with diseases, and some results seem to be coming up every time and then. For example, the bacteroidetes to Firmicutes ratio, at the phylum level, people have found that this seems to be, if you have a higher ratio of this seems to be associated with a dysfunctional or a dysbiotic microbiota.
I see. And so
it is context dependent.
Yeah, and I think, that's the very kind of complicated thing, because there's not just a one or two microbiota that we can say, oh, these are good for you and these are bad. So as you mentioned, I think it's like there's so much work still here to be done to categorize like what is a healthy
so
and unhealthy
I think
gut.
we need to really look at mechanisms specifically, and in fact, the food is going into the metabolites or the metabolome, that so metabolites in the bacteria in the gut or elsewhere can modify the metabolites or release metabolites. And so some people have looked at how these metabolites are changing disease and how they are contributing to disease. And some people have found that these metabolites have receptors on immune cells, on vasculature that mediate disease.
Yeah, so we can, sort of start talking about that. Related to cardiovascular disease and the microbiome, you all have done some work and presented some work and, cited work of others that shows gut maybe dysbiosis and various mechanisms of gut dysbiosis are contributing to cardiovascular disease, whether that's sort of association studies or kind of these mechanistic studies. So what are some of the main pathways that might be linking dysbiosis or the microbiome and cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, that is a fascinating question, and it's also complicated because there are so many pathways that have been touched on and that are contributing to different cardiovascular diseases. There is some work that has looked at, I've mentioned short-chain fatty acids, some work by Jen Puznik at Johns Hopkins. I think she also shared on Twitter that some of these short-chain fatty acids act on G protein coupled receptors that are on the vasculature, and some of these are found in the kidney, and these they act, and they looked at even mouse models that lack these G protein fatty acid receptors, and they found that this contribute to blood pressure elevation and kidney disease. Another pathway that we have looked at is the impact of high salt on these immune cells that sense, like the gut is very rich in immune cells, and like these, in fact, some people have considered it to be the training ground for immune cells, because that is where the immune cells is sensitized to many different antigens in the food, and we find that antigen presenting cells, which can even project projectiles into the gut, can sense the dysbiotic gut, and they can accumulate, they can have increased oxidative stress and lead to formation of these oxidative products that act as self-antigens that activate the immune cells, leading to hypertension. Other people, Francine Marquez has looked at the impact of fiber, whereby they have, mechanistically, they have looked at how these eating a low fiber diet can lead to different reduction in short-chain fatty acids that can lead to cardiovascular disease. They have even looked at the impact of the fiber, low fiber diet in mothers, and that can have epigenetic impacts on the offspring. They have really done a mechanistic study that Francine has shared on Twitter, whereby this can epigenetically impact offspring, leading to cardiovascular disease in the offspring. So this is extremely important. Other people, Dr. Joe Bina, and has looked at some short-chain fatty acids, including the beta hydroxybutyrate, that they have looked mechanistically how this can directly impact vascular dysfunction in hypertension. So in short, those are a few mechanisms. TMAO, when you eat red meat, there is increase in, some studies have shown increase in TMAO that really, leads to, can contribute to atherosclerosis.
Yeah, and that's kind of linking the microbiome and the certain metabolites that you were talking about. I know there's, it seems to be that there's a big role for like inflammation and immune system activation. I guess, when in terms of the metabolites or these immune cells, I know that, say, inflammation in the gut, you would think that it might be like located just in the gut. So how do these metabolites or these different inflammatory molecules translocate from the gut into the cardiovascular system? Does this involve like anything that has to do with quote unquote leaky gut or sort of increased gut permeability? Like, how do these metabolites escape the gut microbiome and sort of get into the cardiovascular system, whether that's, peripheral blood vessels or maybe even the heart, kidneys, and things like that?
Indeed, that is really a very good question. And yes, there is leaky gut, in hypertension and, even cardiovascular disease. People found that, in hypertension, work by Dr. Raizada has shown that there is at UF, University of Florida, has shown that there is gut dysfunction, even morphology of the gut changes, and this directly cause these bacteria to translocate into the blood system. And also, potentially there can be, these immune cells in the gut can travel. In fact, I have a study that we have recently published, and some other works that we are in collaboration with Dr. Tina Kohn, where we find that these immune cells can be translocated from the gut through the lymphatics, and they can go to the kidney, and there is accumulation of isoleucine or these fatty products of oxidative stress known as isoleucine in the lymphatic system. And these immune cells, in the context of high salt and kidney damage, they can be activated, and they can go to the lymphatics and activate T cells there, and those T cells can then go to effector organs where they can induce tissue inflammation.
Yeah, I mean, it's all fascinating, and there seem to be like several different mechanisms. Is there one maybe mechanism that you think might be contributing more than some of the others, or do you think it's just a combination of all of these mechanisms that are, leading to cardiovascular disease? I know that's, a difficult question to answer, and you might be focused on one particular thing, but do you think there's maybe a mechanism that's contributing more towards these adverse outcomes than some of the others?
I mean, that's a very difficult question. I can be biased. I can say
of course,
inflammation is the cause of all disease, which I think if you really look at inflammation, because these immune cells are the ones that are able to infiltrate, basically, to every organ, including brain, and they release these mediators, cytokines, that can even influence the nerves, and that can cause, I don't know if you've heard about the gut brain axis. So if in a biased fashion, I can say inflammation is a unifying factor for this, and there's a lot of in the host microbiota communication and how inflammation is involved. I don't want to underscore a lot of mechanisms great scientists have proposed in the impact of gut microbiota to vascular disease.
Oh, sure, of course. Everyone thinks that the mechanism they're studying is, the most important one to focus on. But it's interesting though, the inflammation, and particularly concerning because, we're focusing on our conversation on cardiovascular disease, but inflammation, as you said, like affects every organ and like system in the body. So if we have inflammation that's stemming from the gut, we're going to get inflammation in the brain, and then probably inflammation everywhere else in the body, which could lead to other things like insulin resistance or impaired glucose metabolism, so can contribute to metabolic disease. I mean, inflammation sort of is just like a cause of many other diseases than cardiovascular disease. So it's, it's potential that, this gut inflammation could be contributing to all of the prevalence of the diseases that we're seeing kind of in modern days. So it's a very interesting mechanism for sure.
I couldn't agree more.
And so you mentioned hypertension and sort of, the interaction between the microbiome and hypertension. And as I was reading your review paper, I was taking note of a couple interesting things that were in there related to one, these so-called fecal microbiota transplant experiments. And I think people would be very interested maybe in just hearing about what these are and what some of these FMT experiments have shown, because they're very interesting. And then I would maybe love to hear about the implications for humans, I guess, if there are, because I know a lot of this work has been done in rodents. But in terms of, say, let's focus on hypertension. What are these, first of all, I guess, what are the fecal microbiome transplant experiments? And then what are some of the data shown regarding those transplant studies in terms of resolving hypertension?
So, another great question. So fecal, we have in our context, in our lab, we have done some of these fecal microbiota transplant experiment in the context of showing whether a direct link between the gut microbiota to salt-induced hypertension, where you get germ-free mice that don't have any bacteria whatsoever, and then you give them you engineer them to get a microbiota that belongs to another mouse, where we have either the high salt diet, or that is a hypertensive mouse, or some people have done this in the context of obesity, where they get these microbiota from obese individuals and transplant them into germ-free mice where they want to determine whether this is microbiota dependent. And you can even go to the grainy details of getting, if you really are convinced that a particular microbiota contributes to hypertension, you can get that specific genus and transplant into these germ-free mice and determine if that has an effect. Some other people, because not everybody can do this. These are complicated experiments, very expensive. Some institutions do not have these facilities of germ-free mice. We are fortunate to have this at Vanderbilt, but some people have killed the host biota using antibiotics and given these mice and another microbiota. This has its own limitations because antibiotics modulate the immune system independent of anything else. So yeah, that's what it means by fecal microbiota transplantation. Clinically, I don't know, as you can see, the application of this clinically is difficult. I mean, transplanting fecal microbiota to modulate disease can have its own challenges. But how about downstream mediators? Can we use probiotics to mitigate adverse effects of dysbiotic bacteria in cardiovascular disease? Can you also, if we know the short chain fatty acids, can we give this back and see if these can mitigate cardiovascular effects? I think Fran shared a study where they, which is, I think she mentioned that is still under review, whereby they are doing a clinical trial where they are giving these short chain fatty acids to people and to determine if this has cardiovascular effects.
So rather than say do the FMT, they're basically giving them the metabolites that are produced by the microbiome instead. So the short chain fatty acids and things like that have been shown to be beneficial. It's more like less clinically challenging, I guess, to do that than to do a microbiome swap.
Yes, but how about prevention using like high fiber diet, low salt diet, and I know this is difficult, given some of the challenges. Some people do not have access to these healthy foods. But if that is the case, then we can really go downstream of this pathway. We can scavenge products of lipid oxidation, isolated glandins. We already have some of the things, these scavengers available. We can give probiotics. We can give short chain fatty acids.
Yeah, and I just the experiments when I was reading about them are so interesting that you can almost say whether you're giving like a young mouse an old microbiome and maybe cause it to develop hypertension, or the other way around, if you give an old rodent, young mouse or rodent's microbiome that kind of resolves hypertension. But again, I think like you mentioned, the applications for humans, we might not be able to have a microbiome swap in a pill, although I have kind of read some stuff. There seem to be like some risks that might be associated with that though. I mean, because if you're just thinking about one mechanism, oh, we're going to give them the microbiome to resolve hypertension. Well, there could be maybe other non-beneficial metabolites in there, or maybe these adverse interactions with like somebody who's getting the transplant. So I feel like there's just a lot to iron out there. So are you aware of any human trials going on where they're doing FMT?
I know I haven't seen an actual paper out. I've just had rumors that, this of being done. Human FMT, I'm not aware of some any peer-reviewed human study. And this might have been, I might not have seen this. I'm just aware of people using other things in, giving, intervening with probiotics and short-chain fatty acids. That work by Dr. Dave Dagan, he was also interacting on Twitter at Baylor College of Medicine. He has seen that, fasting and intermittent fasting causes, mitigates hypertension by, through a microbiota pathway. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of any studies using FMT in humans.
No, yeah, nor am I. So I was just curious if any of that work was going on. Still kind of on the note related to hypertension, maybe before we move on to some diet and lifestyle stuff. I was interested in that some data seems to show that the microbiome, or maybe certain strains of bacteria, can actually inhibit some of the effects of like different cardiovascular drugs. So can you explain some of that data and how like the microbiome might limit the efficacy of some of the different drugs, maybe to treat like hypertension or high cholesterol and things like that?
Yes, I mean, people have published on this, where that microbiota can release, modulators that can alter, the structure of bacteria. I don't know whether Dr. Jobina has published her work yet, but, I attended her talk at Experimental Biology recently, and she was talking about, some of these microbiota altering hypertensive medicine. I mean, medicines including the ACE inhibitors and that, translating into how these, how animal models or even humans can respond to these antihypertensive products. So yes, that is true that this bacteria can alter the response of drugs to disease.
Yeah, which is fascinating because, I mean, I know, you have a lot of studies or clinical trials that show, oh, maybe this person doesn't respond to a certain blood pressure lowering medication. Like, well, maybe now you have to sort of alter their microbiome as well as give them this blood pressure lowering medication in order for it to have the efficacy. So that's just, very interesting that some of these different strains seem to like inhibit the effects of those drugs. And who knows, maybe that could be a reason why some people don't respond to certain medications or not.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So now I know everyone's going to be interested now in, what can we do to, say, increase the diversity or the health of our microbiome? I think that's what everybody seems to be all about these days. There are drinks, there are, people recommend drinking kombucha or eating yogurt. I mean, there's several things out there, and a lot of it hasn't been researched, but I know you're well aware of kind of a lot of the research in this area. So I would like to touch upon maybe some of the areas that have been researched regarding the microbiome, and then diet and lifestyle, how that can affect it. So the first thing is kind of diet and maybe diet composition. So can you talk about the data on vegetarian, say, or plant-based diets compared to diets that are higher in maybe animal products or animal protein, and how those have been shown to influence the microbiome? Because I think people are well aware, at least, of certain diets associated with cardiovascular disease, but how might those diets affect the microbiome and then thereby impact maybe cardiovascular disease?
Yes. So when you speak of vegetarian diet, if impact of fiber, most of the fiber comes from vegetarian diet is the fiber comes from plants. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to mainly focus on eating animal-based products versus plant, the impact of fiber on gut microbiota and its effect on hypertension is well known. So there you go. And then, when you talk about TMAO, this comes from red meat and eggs. So that we know that you're going to eat foods that are very high in this path leads to formation of TMAO, that can predispose to cardiovascular disease, including atherosclerosis. So the impact of, and then we have also looked at eating a high salt diet, how that can induce dysbiosis, and the impact of fasting. So it is well known that diet definitely plays a role in modulating the gut microbiota. And so the fast, exercise, I think there are some studies on exercise, although I'm not aware at this point in time how this impacts, but it makes sense that exercise can impact the gut microbiota. So I think the easiest, the cheapest intervention to modulating cardiovascular disease via the gut microbiota is through diet. Eat a low salt diet, eat a high fiber diet, low in red meat or choline, that is a TMO, and you can mitigate, and then fast. Exercise, and then that can mitigate your cardiovascular disease, but these are difficult, this is not possible to do. So that's why we're doing research to see if we can intervene.
Yeah, a lot of the things aren't as easy as, say, like taking a pill that will give you some short chain fatty acids or something like that. Fasting and exercise and animal plant-based diets, those all require sort of a drastic change maybe in certain lifestyles. I find the fiber very interesting, because I think for a long time, people and everyone hears about fiber. Oh, you need to have fiber so you don't get like constipated, to keep you regular. But it doesn't seem like that is honestly the main role of fiber in health. It really seems like it's feeding the microbiome, getting these beneficial short chain fatty acids that can therefore have all these beneficial effects. It's kind of something that I've realized in the recent years. I'm like, I don't think fiber is important for, keeping one regular. It's more important for feeding the microbiome. And so I think that's something that is important for everyone to understand.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It, prevents inflammation and cardiovascular disease.
And so intermittent fasting and calorie restriction, I know those are also kind of two mechanisms that might help improve the microbiome. And they're obviously, I think there's plenty of data out there that intermittent fasting and maybe time restricted feeding or calorie restriction, they have a beneficial effect on a lot of cardiovascular disease biomarkers, and can maybe reduce the risk for cardiovascular disease. So what is kind of some of the data on fasting, and maybe how might that influence the microbiome?
Yeah, so the research out there has shown that these intermittent fasting and actually restriction of calories can increase some chemicals known as polyphenols, these these metabolites, and it also can increase. This can also increase beta hydroxybutyrate, which modulates can reduce your inflammation, and that cardiovascular disease can be reduced that way. So
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so people have found that intermittent fasting really leads to enrichment in species of bacteria that are known to be beneficial, including Bacteroidetes, and people have shown that Clamantia, some bacteria of the species of Clamantia can be increased by intermittent fasting, and this can lead to beneficial effects on. I've written a review recently, I don't know if you've seen it yet, on bile acids and the interaction of sex hormones and how that can impact the gut microbiota. But all this can be downstream of intermittent fasting and even other dietary interventions.
Certainly. And then is a lot of the data kind of available on fasting in the microbiome? Is that rodent data, or are there any human data that you know of?
So there is some not big, they're not clinical trials, but human intervention trials have been done. I don't have anything on the top of my head,
Sure.
but I think there's intervention trials, small trials that have been done to show that intermittent fasting and caloric restriction is beneficial for the gut microbiota.
Yeah, and if there aren't any, I'm sure that there kind of are some that are ongoing right now. I can imagine a trial like that would be very expensive. Again, doing all these analyses of the microbiome doesn't seem like it's a cheap thing to do. So, you're not going to have these long-term studies. They cost a lot of money, and take a long time.
Yeah, there is a study by David Duggan I mentioned, and it was recently published in Salk Research. I'm trying to see, I don't remember if he had a human component, but it's really very clearly and mechanistically implicated intermittent fasting to gut microbiota and vascular disease.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I'll also I'm sure there's things on time restricted feeding, because there's obviously so many different iterations of like intermittent fasting, but it will be interesting to see hopefully when some of these trials get published. What about probiotics? How do probiotics, are those beneficial for the gut microbiome and cardiovascular disease? That seems like a large area, and I've been not, skeptical, but like everything's marketed these days with having probiotics in it or in active cultures and everything like that. So how can probiotics help the microbiome? And then on another note, like, maybe is it better if that comes from, say, food sources like fermented food or yogurt, or taking maybe a probiotic supplement like a pill? Do you think that there's any difference maybe between those routes of administration and how that might be beneficial?
Probiotics, I mean, that is really sticky because there's so many products. You go to the store and you see a whole line of probiotics and you wonder,
Yes.
Where is the evidence of this? And who knows what is the content of these probiotics, how it contributes to, even health. Some of these probiotics really have live bacteria. You're eating live bacteria. So it makes nervous as well. But I mean, things like eating, people have eaten yogurt for decades. And I don't, and some of the probiotics that have been, that have bacteria that have been demonstrated to be beneficial, you can trust that. I don't use probiotics myself because of the obvious reasons. I mean, but I eat yogurt, and I know that fiber can modulate and modify my gut system, my microbiota to a more beneficial. So while we are really doing research determining what are the right probiotics for intervention, I think, knowing and teaching people that they can modify their own gut microbiota to a good, healthy microbiota through diet, I think would be a good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they wouldn't have to waste their money on probiotics that have kind of little probably data to support them. It's a fancy word, but again, it's one of those words that a lot of people don't know, even myself included. Like, I don't know what it means. Like, what is a probiotic? Maybe, it gives me bacteria, but like you said, who knows whether those are the right kind of bacteria or what those are doing. So, I mean, there's so much nuance there that, needs to kind of be considered for sure.
And there's so much on the market, and and some of this is not evidence-based. So
absolutely. And there's little known about whether, say, if you're buying a probiotic product, whether those are like live bacteria, how long I'm sure things like storage and heat and how long that product has been there affect, because they're living organisms. So, they're not going to stay alive forever. And if you, store them wrong or something like that, they might just die and then it's sort of useless, but very, very complicated stuff.
Yeah, I know.
All right. So the final thing that I'd like to talk about are some of the data or the effects of aging and maybe sex differences on the microbiota. So I know, sex differences in all areas, kind of a physiology and cardiovascular physiology, a very popular area, how are these differences in cardiovascular disease presence between males and females. So are there any data on sex differences and whether maybe males or females have a more diverse or a healthier microbiome? Because I know that there are differences in cardiovascular disease between males and females. So perhaps the microbiome is playing a role, but what is there out there to suggest that there may be differences or perhaps there is nothing currently?
So, I know that there is emerging literature from, just attending conferences on these sex differences. People, like Jen Puznik is working on some sex difference, and the impact is real. I've just published a work on bioacids, and we have work that we haven't published yet. And there are sex differences even in the metabolites produced by this microbiota, bioacids, and these really are known to interact with sex hormones. So we haven't published because we're trying to work out a mechanism, but yes, that is definitely, there has to be some sex differences. And the impact of aging, I don't know if someone has done a long time. These are extremely difficult studies to do that, because you really, for aging, a good study has to follow people, for a long time to see how that their microbiota changes over time. Because, if you just go in and compare young versus old, you don't know what else is influencing the gut microbiota, but these will be very important studies to do.
Yeah, for sure. Just doing a cross-sectional study where you take some old people and you take some young people and compare their microbiome. That's, it's informational, but it's not as great as, say, we have this longitudinal study over 20 years or 30 or maybe even more on people and saying this is actually how your microbiome changes. That would be very cool. But again, it's unfortunate that these studies would take so long. That's obviously why we use rodent models in a lot of research, because their lifespans are so much shorter. But it would be nice to have some of these longitudinal studies, and maybe those will be done. But it would seem like aging would have some sort of effect. But again, who knows what the confounding factors of that are? Is it a change in diet or lifestyle that comes with age, or is it a direct effect of aging? So I'm sure all those things need to be ironed out as well.
Yeah, and the role of inflammation, like we mentioned, inflammation, both sex and age contribute to inflammation, and we see that sex differences and that age differences are already established. So the question is, the gut microbiota contributing to these sex differences?
Yes, definitely. Okay, so we had a few listener question and answers that listener questions rather, and you'll provide the answers, but listener questions from Twitter that I'd kind of like to get to. Some of these aren't necessarily directly related to the microbiome. So if I ask something, you can feel free to just pass on it and we don't have to discuss it, but we had about 4 questions. So I'll just, I'll ask all 4. And if there's something that you don't feel like you should or need to discuss, then we can just skip over that one. So the first question here, it comes from Vince, and he was interested, and I think you may have responded to him, but he was interested in whether blood pressure medications are effective in reducing overall mortality in people with elevated blood pressure, in light of the discovery that it's not necessarily maybe high blood pressure the main concern, but the discrepancy between systolic and diastolic, meaning is the pulse pressure maybe more important than, say, just elevated systolic and diastolic. Do you have any maybe comments on that?
Yes, so that question has been fully and very well answered by the experts in the field. They've shown and shared data that implicates that this aggressive treatment to lower, even to lower even isolated blood pressure, whether it's systolic or diastolic, reduces mortality due to cardiovascular disease. So yes, I think it plays a role to, and treating it aggressively seems to help. I'm not the expert.
Yeah,
those answers were informative to me as well.
Yeah, for sure. And, I would agree in terms of anything that I've seen, the blood pressure medications do seem effective in not only reducing blood pressure, but, reducing long-term mortality. But again, there's lots of studies on that, more than we have, time to maybe cite or go into today. So Vince also had the second question. He was just interested in if you knew anything about coenzyme Q10 or CoQ10 in reducing maybe blood pressure or ventricular hypertrophy. Are you aware of anything on CoQ10?
No, in fact, I was so fascinated by his question. I've been reading, but I don't see any reliable research showing it's a supplement, and it has its benefits. But in terms of directly lowering blood pressure, I've not seen any reliable data. I would just recommend, if you have blood pressure, just go and get a prescription to lower your blood pressure, not rely on CoQ10 with the data we have seen right now. So I'm not able to say that, to speak to this CoQ10. Mainly, I'm not, particularly an expert in that field, but I think there are many well-known blood-lowering medications that it is more urgent and important to follow the doctor's guidelines to lower that blood pressure than to rely on a nutritional supplement.
Yeah, I would agree. In terms of anything I know about coenzyme Q10, I'm sure that there are some studies that might show benefits for various outcomes, but I don't think that there's probably sufficient evidence to show that it's effective in lowering blood pressure. You can find a study that will maybe show a benefit in anything, but I think the totality of the evidence, I'm sure, is kind of insufficient regarding that. So I don't know much about it, just as kind of you either. So
yeah, but it was fascinating enough. I really searched and looked, but I could not find reliable evidence.
Right. So the next question comes from Maida, and she was wondering if you knew anything about whether long distance runners or endurance athletes may have lots of visceral fat or cardiac sheath fat, as well as cardiovascular inflammation.
I mean, that is another question that fascinated me, and it's another where I could not find that. I thought long distance running is healthy for you, and it will be doing the opposite, reducing visceral fat. So I don't know. I needed some additional, information what motivated this question, but I could not find research showing that long distance runs have visceral accumulation of fat and cardiac sheath fat. And so, I would probably need more information to be able to answer that question, but I would be thinking opposite.
Yeah, definitely. And and I am kind of well aware of some of the data in this area, just being, this is kind of one of my areas that I'm interested in, not only due to my research, but also being a long distance runner. But there are some data that show long-term kind of veteran endurance athletes might have these signs of early cardiac fibrosis. And they've shown some of that. I don't know about the visceral fat. I wouldn't assume that would be kind of a major thing. As you mentioned, endurance exercise seems to reduce subcutaneous and visceral fat. But in terms of the cardiovascular inflammation, there might be some data regarding that in terms of if you're, working out way too hard for too many years, it might have some adverse effects, but I don't think that the data are, I feel like at this point, maybe sufficient to say that, oh, it's really, really bad for you. I think you can overdo anything, but, I'm not convinced at the moment that it's necessarily damaging to your cardiovascular system or cardiac tissue to do a lot of endurance exercise, but I could be proven wrong in other people. But there's a lot of published data on this, and Maida, if you're interested, or anybody else interested in learning about that, I have lots of articles on my Substack that I've written with some of that data. So it's kind of interesting, but overall, distance running is unhealthy, but perhaps there's a point at which you can overdo it. Everything, right?
That is really fascinating, and thank you for sharing that. I wasn't aware. It'd be really nice to know about these, these impacts, and that, I don't know if that there can be a contribution or mitigation by other genetic factors happening in different people. I really don't know whether this is a generalizable impact. Even if you're talking about cardiac fibrosis and inflammation, I don't even know whether this is generalizable or there's some predisposing genetic or even environmental factors.
Yeah, no, that's interesting that you bring that up, because I'm sure you've heard of sort of these rare occurrences where somebody will die during a marathon, and then, they'll have a cardiac arrest, and then they find out that they had some abnormal heart condition, but it's not the marathon that killed them. They had this heart condition that was undiagnosed, and then the marathon sort of triggered it. So it's important to note that millions of people run a marathon each year and they don't die, but these people with the underlying genetic conditions who then happen to run then might have this elevated risk. And it's going to happen if you have enough people participating in these types of things.
Yeah. And there have been controversy, of course, should people be tested before they go for a
Yes,
marathon?
right,
This is
right.
a lot of ethical issues, but this is, you're speaking to personalized medicine and personalized advice and personalized intervention. So you're right. Not everybody who runs a marathon dies suddenly of cardiac disease.
Right. If that were the case, nobody would be doing them. But yeah, I do know in certain countries, I know Italy, but in order for like kids to participate in sports at like a young age, they have to undergo a cardiac stress test basically and then after they pass that, say you can't participate, say in basketball or cross country unless you pass a cardiac stress test. I know that doesn't exist in the US currently, at least on a wide scale, but I'm sure that would be something that could, prevent the small amount of deaths that might happen per year. But, you hear about the case where a kid passes out during a basketball game and like dies because he has cardiac hypertrophy or something. So, you can prevent it. It's very rare.
The sickle cell trait. I mean, if you have it, you need to check this because it is known to contribute to predispose to cardiac hypertrophy and sudden death during exertion. So some of those things are known, but they are not generalizable.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And then the final question here is from Mark. Again, you sort of addressed this a little bit, but he was asking, are there known mechanisms that link gut microbiome and endothelial function? And
Yes.
Is anything known about how probiotic supplementation might impact these mechanisms? I know we talked a little bit about that, but maybe we can just reiterate what you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So yeah, we've answered this throughout, and that has also been extensively addressed on Twitter. Yes, there are some known mechanisms, not extensive. We want really to see more mechanisms, how the gut microbiota directly contributes to inflammation and vascular dysfunction. But there are some studies that are beginning to emerge from Dr. Bina Joe's lab, where they study germ-free mice and mice that don't, they have conventional mice that have a gut microbiota, and they see differences in vascular dysfunction, and they've been able to zero down to, for example, beta hydroxybutyrate. They have a pathway there that leads to really they have done actual vascular studies and done direct studies where they see some effects there. We have also published on where, eating a high salt diet can induce inflammation. We know that these immune cells can travel and infiltrate the vasculature and release cytokines that are known to induce oxidative stress and directly also cause vascular dysfunction.
Yeah, so the main thing, again, kind of tying it back, seems to be is oxidative stress and inflammation, which is well known to impact vascular endothelial function. Do you know whether the endothelial function, the measurements that have been done, is that sort of maybe coronary arteries or peripheral endothelial function, or I'm sure it just depends on what study you're looking at?
Yeah, so I tagged Camilla in there. These are really, you can do the studies I'm aware of have been done in resistance arteries. These are like the really small vessels that mainly contribute to your blood pressure because they're the ones that are able to expand, and so they've done studies that have been done on these resistance arteries that have been obtained from the mesenteric artery. I know that different vascular beds cannot be generalized because they react differently. But some of these studies have been done on resistant arteries. Some have been done on the aorta. Coronary artery, I'm not aware of a direct study that has done this.
Great. Okay, so, we talked about a lot today, and I think, I certainly learned a lot, and I think listeners will hopefully learn a lot about not only how the microbiome is affecting their cardiovascular health, but also sort of how they can take certain steps to improve their microbiome and reduce their cardiovascular disease risk. So I appreciate you sort of going over all of this data. There's a lot of data out there, and I would encourage people, if they want to look on Twitter about all the studies that have been thrown out there in our conversations, to go and check that out. So lastly, if the audience wants to learn more about you, Dr. Kirabo, and follow you maybe on social media or find out more about your work, could you maybe provide some places where they can find you on the internet?
Yes, I have a website. I need to update it, but I have a website. But also, I think Twitter. I'm active on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Annet Kirabo C1. So that they can follow me on Twitter. I always update. If I have a publication, I share it there. And if they can follow us on Twitter, that is the best way of really keeping up with what we are doing.
Great. Yeah, I will link. I'll find a link to your website, and I'll also I'll post a link to your Twitter on in the show notes for this episode, so people can hopefully give you a follow and maybe say hey and interact with you. And you are pretty active and always tweeting out new articles and things like that. So that's how I initially kind of discovered who you were and found out about all of this interesting research. So Dr. Kirabo, again, thanks so much for joining me today, and I look forward to releasing this episode.
Thank you so much, Brady. I'm really appreciative of you to include me in this, and I've learned a lot from you as well. And thank you so much.
Of course. Have a great rest of the day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.